Israel is threatening further military action and is calling up 300,000 reservists. They're being reinforced, or those reinforcements rather, are being sent to southern Israel, and the military says it has taken control of those border towns which were overrun by Hamas gunmen. But there are reports that some fighting is ongoing. For the latest, let's bring in Willem Marx, who joins us from West Jerusalem. Israel has now imposed what it calls a complete siege. What are you hearing on the ground there?
So the Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, has been speaking over the last couple of hours following a security assessment with the Israeli military's command in the south of Israel. He's been talking in quite stark language about what the Israeli military and other agencies will be doing. He said that he's ordered a full siege on the Gaza Strip. Quote, no power, no food, no gas, no electricity. Everything is closed. We are fighting, he says, human animals, and we act accordingly. The death toll amongst Israelis has now risen above 800, and there is a very clear sense of anger amongst the people I speak to here in West Jerusalem. In conversations, many of them saying they are prepared for the Israeli military to carry out what they acknowledged would constitute war crimes in Gaza if it was able to achieve what they would like to see, many of them telling me, which is the destruction of the armed faction Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. Politically, this is a very complex moment for Mr. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister here, because he's meeting with some of his political opponents through representatives, trying to figure out whether there is the possibility of creating an emergency unity cabinet, essentially uniting different political parties behind the Israeli military in particular, ahead of what could be a very difficult few days ahead of them.
Israel has a huge pool of reservists to draw on, as we've been reporting. How is that playing out on the ground? It's likely going to be quite a logistic feat.
Yeah, they've announced over the course of the last few hours, 300,000 reservists have now been called up. There is a huge pool of people across this country who've served in the Israeli military at some point, typically during their younger years. Many of them choose to remain as active reservists, meaning they can be called upon during situations like this. That will happen through phone calls, emails, even text messages. They'll be informed that they are being called up. They will then have to report to a local office and essentially then be deployed to their unit, wherever that may be. Many of those, of course, in that area around Gaza. But let's not forget, because of the military activity involving the Israeli military and Hezbollah in the north of Israel, southern Lebanon, also quite significant numbers of both weaponry and personnel being deployed up to Israel's northern border as well.
Some of the discussions have centred around how this attack on Saturday has somewhat unified the Israeli government and politicians there. Is that what you're hearing?
Well, over the course of this year, essentially this government that Mr. Netanyahu leads is a very narrow majority inside the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. He's had to ally himself with some far-right parties, and that has created a huge amount of dissatisfaction amongst many ordinary Israelis who'd not voted for Mr. Netanyahu's Likud party. And the challenge throughout the last few months has been for Mr. Netanyahu to try and find common ground with his political opponents. We've not seen very much of that until this past weekend. Several senior opposition leaders now saying they are prepared to work with Mr. Netanyahu in some kind of emergency government, Emily, except for one of them in particular saying he would attach conditions to any kind of cooperation. Mr. Yair Lapid saying that he would only take part in an emergency government with Netanyahu if Mr. Netanyahu was to fire some of his most senior ministers from his far-right alliance parties. And that's not something that's going to be taken lightly by Mr. Netanyahu, given his razor-thin majority in the Knesset.
Willem, I want to ask you another question, but before I do, I just want to remind our audience that some of the pictures that they're seeing on their screen are quite harrowing, and viewer discretion should be advised, or it should be observed at this point, because they really are quite devastating images. Returning to you now, Willem, where to from here? We're hearing there could be plans of a ground invasion of Gaza. Obviously, the intelligence from the Israeli military will be tight-lipped. They'll be keeping their cards close to their chest. But have you heard any intel from that perspective, given that there are hundreds of thousands of reservists being called up?
No specific intel, but it's very clear that when you have that kind of operation in mind, you will need vast numbers of ground forces, infantry in particular, in order to try and intrude on such a massive area, very heavily populated area. We've seen just continued airstrikes so far, but the quantity of tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery that seem to be massing close to Gaza, according to our colleague Charlie Stratford, who's down near Sderot at the moment, seems to indicate that a ground invasion, an incursion inside Gaza past that barrier fence that Hamas itself breached several places over the course of the weekend cannot be ruled out at this point.
Make sure to subscribe to a channel to the latest news from RDZ World News.